After tying the knot, Valerie Justice was looking forward to a wonderful life with her teenage daughter and new husband.
Lawrence seemed to be a great father, and we were excited to have the American dream.
It was the start of a new chapter for Valerie.
But Valerie never dreamed the man she loved would tear her family apart in the most horrific way.
I never knew a person could be that evil.
He was willing to do anything to keep the truth from coming out.
I was screaming and crying. I just could not believe that this was happening.
When it comes to love and marriage, things aren't always as they seem. It was a self-imposed rule. Valerie Justice would not date anyone until her 15-year-old daughter, Erin, graduated high school in their Naperville, Illinois town.
Erin and I were extremely close. I had been divorced for 6 years, and she was the joy of my life. I wanted to get married again, but I wanted to concentrate on getting her through high school first. After that, I could get on with my own personal life.
But in 2003, when Erin spent her summer vacation with her father, Valerie soon felt a void in her heart.
I missed Erin tremendously, so I would visit my mother often because we lived not too far away from each other, and she was retired, and she was babysitting all the time.
And one afternoon, while visiting her mother, Valerie was happy to bump into a familiar face, 37-year-old Lawrence Lovejoy.
My mother had started babysitting for his little girl. And so many times when I would go by my mom's house, he was there. Lawrence was going through a divorce, and he was actually spending quite a bit of time there at my mom's. He was a little rough around the edges, just a t-shirt and jeans kind of person. But he was funny, and he was very charming.
Well, Lawrence was easygoing, and he was easy to talk to. He worked as a painter, and he was trying to get back on his feet.
Lawrence had been mentioned to my mother that he was looking for a place to stay. So I made the suggestion that since Erin was gone for the summer, he could share my apartment. He'd have a place to stay, I'd have some help with the rent. And I thought that would be a good arrangement.
Lawrence thought so too, and was more than happy to accept.
I would look forward to going home knowing that someone was there. He was rather entertaining, he made me laugh, and we started spending time together.
My sister Valerie was very serious, and Lawrence was the funny guy. Valerie needed that break in her seriousness by his sense of humor.
By the end of the summer, Valerie decided to break her own rule.
One of the goals that he had expressed to me was to own a home, and I've always wanted to own my own home. He wanted to really progress through life. I found myself attracted to him, and then we ended up in a relationship.
But when Erin returned home in August, she made it known she wasn't keen on having a man around the house.
It was hard for her to imagine anyone else being in the house besides her and I. She didn't want to lose her privacy. But I did not want to end the relationship.
But Valerie did want to do things right.
So at that point in my life, it was my desire to be more Christian. I did not want to continue to live with Lawrence without being married to him.
So Lawrence came up with the perfect solution.
Lawrence looked me straight in the face and told me,
I'm ready.
And would I marry him?
Yes.
So I did say yes, that I would marry him.
After 4 months together, Valerie and Lawrence tied the knot at the local courthouse with Erin by their side.
So it was a simple ceremony. No big wedding dress, no flowers. We walked out and we were holding hands and we were on our way. The future seemed very bright.
But that brightness would soon turn to darkness as Valerie realized the choice she made would destroy everything she held dear.
He had a whole nother side to him.
She had no idea this monster was lurking in her house.
I just cried and cried. I just could not believe that he would do something so vicious.
In November of 2003, newlyweds Valerie Justice and Lawrence Lovejoy were eager to start their life together with Valerie's teenage daughter, Erin.
I was excited. I had everything that at this point that I desired. I had my daughter by my side. I was married again. And we started the process of trying to see if we could qualify for a mortgage and buy a home.
It was very important to Valerie to become a homeowner. They were on the hunt for the right house that they could all be happy in.
But the following month, Valerie came home to find Lawrence and Erin in a screaming match.
Lawrence was so enraged, they were yelling back and forth. He was very upset that Erin had been on the phone all afternoon, supposedly talking to boys. I didn't quite understand why he was so concerned.
There was a disconnect in their parenting styles. Lawrence felt he was going to be the one to discipline her, but Valerie didn't feel it was Lawrence's place.
I informed him that any decisions that had to do with Erin were to be totally left up to me. He really got upset because I was basically telling him that I don't need your help. And he wasn't happy about that.
So Valerie did her best to smooth things over.
I talked to Erin and, asked her to just wait until I'm home, before you get on the phone, and then that way there won't be any problems.
For the next few months, things seemed to be going according to plan.
There were no more big blowouts between Erin and Lawrence. We bought a new puppy for the family, and we're making plans to purchase a townhome.
But there were a few sacrifices. Valerie took on a second job as a cashier to earn extra money for closing costs, which meant Erin was at times a latchkey kid.
Erin would come home on her own, and I would call her and check in on her. So, we had a good system of keeping in touch with each other. Plus, Lawrence was home during the day, and then he worked the midnight shift at his company.
And Valerie couldn't help but notice that Erin and Lawrence seemed to be fighting less often.
Erin was in driver's ed, and so Lawrence volunteered to take her out driving. When they got home, they were both laughing, and I was relieved to see that things were getting better.
So Valerie set her sights on the closing of their new house, which was set for March 5th, 2004. But just 2 days before the closing, when Valerie made a routine call home to check on Erin, everything changed.
Erin answered the phone, and I said, "What are you doing?" She sounded just kind of aloof. Are you okay? Like she was preoccupied. We got off the phone, but something just didn't sit right with me.
And when Valerie received a call just a short time later from a police officer, she knew in an instant something was terribly wrong.
Lawrence had a dark side.
It was just a nightmare.
I was in complete shock. What he did was just devastating.
On March 3rd, 2004, Valerie Justice felt a knot in her stomach after receiving a call from the local police.
The police officer said that they had my daughter. There was a problem. He said that I needed to come to this address he gave me. That's all he would tell me. I hung up the phone with him. I was scared. Now I'm like, what the heck's going on?
Valerie was in a panic as she immediately raced to the address.
I just had no idea what could possibly be the problem. When I arrived, the police officer immediately took me up to an apartment. It was a friend of Aaron's who she went to school with.
Officers led Valerie into the living room, where she found Aaron sitting on the couch, visibly shaken.
That's when the police officer told me, according to Aaron, Lawrence had sexually assaulted her. So I said, "What do you mean?" Aaron said she had come home from track practice, and Lawrence offered to give her a massage. She told him to stop, and he just kept going. I was shocked. After all, he had a daughter of his own, and it really upset me. I was like, what am I going to do? What am I going to do? I'm listening to what she is saying, and I'm trying to absorb it all. I didn't want to believe that this was really happening. But I made it very clear to Aaron that I was going to support her no matter what.
At the hospital, Valerie stood by Aaron's side as a doctor administered a rape kit.
The doctor told me that there were no physical signs of penetration. That put a shadow of a doubt in my mind. I was struggling with the whole thing. I questioned her, and I said, if this for some reason was because you're having a problem with him, I said, tell me now, because this is pretty serious. But she assured me that she was telling the absolute truth.
At first, I just didn't believe it. I was like, no, that just can't be. He's just not like that.
Meanwhile, at the police station, Lawrence told investigators something else entirely.
Lawrence indicated that Aaron was just upset at him because he had questioned her cell phone usage. And because he was questioning her, she made the entire story up.
Without a confession, police didn't have enough to hold him.
There was saliva found on her cheek and on her breast. And it was the decision of the DuPage County State's Attorney's Office not to file charges until the DNA results came back from the crime lab. So Lawrence was not arrested that evening.
In the meantime, Valerie had saved enough money to close on the townhouse herself and settled on a new living arrangement, which didn't include Lawrence.
I got everything moved, and I didn't really know where he was staying. I told Lawrence I did not want him around my daughter until we had gotten the DNA results. If the DNA results came back positive, my plan was to divorce Lawrence immediately.
But just a few weeks later, Valerie found herself in a bind and was compelled to ask Lawrence for a favor.
The puppy had gotten sick and needed to have a follow-up appointment with the vet. I asked Lawrence, and he made the appointment, and he was going to take her to the vet.
There was no chance Erin would run into Lawrence at the house, since she was going to spend the week with her father. But at the last minute, Erin's father canceled.
He was supposed to pick her up in the morning, but he had called to say that he was not going to be able to do that. So I called Lawrence, and I told him that he would need to move the puppy's appointment. And then he said to me, okay, I will call the vet and do that right now. So I was relieved.
Within the hour, Valerie decided to check in on her daughter and make sure she was waking up.
When I called, I didn't get any answer. And I'm wondering, why isn't she answering? I started to get a little anxious. I finally went to my boss and I said, I just need to go home and check and see what's going on. I was thinking, maybe she just overslept, maybe she was in the shower. But, I had no idea. I had no idea.
And when Valerie arrived home, nothing could have prepared her for the horror she would find.
It was the most heinous attack that I have ever seen.
It was unimaginable what he did.
There was blood everywhere. My whole world just ended.
On the morning of March 27, 2004, Valerie Justice prayed that her daughter Erin was okay as she arrived home.
I started to call her name and was not getting any response. Immediately, I knew something was wrong. I got into the hallway, and I could tell there was something on the wall. I ran into her bedroom, and she's not in her bed. Across the hall was her bathroom. I pushed the bathroom door open. I saw Erin in the bathtub. There was blood all over the floor. I knew when I saw her that it was too late. I felt like I was suspended in space. It just felt like I was just spinning.
Stunned with horror, Valerie ran to the hall and called 911.
Now all I can remember is the dispatcher telling me that I have to stop screaming and that they were sending somebody over. I just sat down on the stairs. I couldn't move.
Police arrived within minutes and found that whoever had murdered Erin resorted to a disturbing level of violence.
Erin was stabbed, she was bludgeoned, and then she was drowned. Erin had lethal doses of cold medication in her system. I believe she was forced to take it. There was a rather deep knife wound to her neck. Whoever did this had a lot of hatred in them. It was the most brutal, vicious, heinous attack that I have ever seen.
And Lawrence Lovejoy quickly rose to the top of the list as a person of interest.
The next day, we began interviewing Lawrence Lovejoy. From 7 until 12:30, he could not account for what he did and where he was at. But we didn't have enough evidence to keep him, so we had to let him go.
As investigators continued to gather evidence, Valerie tried to come to grips with what had happened.
It was so hard to fathom that someone could be that evil and do that to a helpless child. I knew in my gut that Lawrence was responsible for my daughter's death.
So I went to Copley Hospital. When I got there, all the kids was there. And I realized that it was real.
3 months later, the DNA found on Erin during the alleged rape came back as a positive match to Lawrence Lovejoy. And when police identified Lawrence's footprint at the crime scene, there was no denying that he was Erin's killer.
I believe Lawrence Lovejoy went over there to try to talk her out of filing charges against him for a sexual assault because he thought the results would come back with his DNA. And Erin was not giving that to him. He killed her in such a brutal way, I think he just snapped.
On August 20th, 2004, Lawrence Lovejoy was arrested and charged with the first-degree murder of Erin Justice. 1 month later, he was indicted on charges of sexual assault and sexual abuse.
I was absolutely sick to my stomach. I felt responsible. It was me who allowed this monster into our lives. It hits me like a brick.
Valerie now realized that Lawrence must have become obsessed with Erin.
His rage about Erin being on the phone was out of place. He had some jealous rage against Erin talking to boys. I think the reason why Lawrence offered to take Erin driving that day was to gain her confidence. Maybe she would feel close to him. But he didn't know my Erin.
In 2007, Lawrence Lovejoy went to trial and was found guilty of first-degree murder. In light of his conviction, the sexual assault and abuse charges were dropped. But because of a technicality with a blood test, the conviction was overturned 2 years later.
That was discouraging, but we knew we had to go to trial on this again. It was going to be another guilty.
Finally, in 2011, Lawrence Lovejoy was once again convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison.
It was rather bittersweet when Lawrence was convicted and didn't bring my daughter back. But I was glad that he couldn't be free to harm anyone else.
Today, Valerie is still haunted by Aaron's death and wonders if she could have done more to protect her.
I never saw any sign that I needed to fear for my daughter's life. There just were no signs that he would have been capable of such horrible actions.
It was really tough. It hurts every day. But it's through faith and conviction that we all carry on.
I know that in this world no one's perfect, but Aaron was perfect for me. We were a perfect fit. I look forward to seeing my precious daughter again.
Crystal Kunkel felt like the luckiest girl alive when she became the wife of the most amazing man.
Tommy was an incredible husband and father. He was great with the kids. Everything was perfect.
But this family man had a simmering secret.
I was totally shocked.
It was 10 years of deceit, lies, and betrayal.
And Crystal's world would soon crumble around her when her husband was accused of the most horrific crimes.
These people are dangerous human beings.
I was completely devastated that I'd married somebody capable of something so horrible.
When it comes to love and marriage, things aren't always as they seem. Living near a place called Holiday, Florida might seem like fun, but for Crystal Kunkel, life was far from a tropical vacation. In the spring of 2002, after ending a 3-year relationship with the father of her newborn, the 22-year-old found herself transforming from a carefree young woman into a caregiver.
It had been 4 months since the last relationship. I was a single mother working really long hours at a window treatment company. I had a 6-month-old son, and between working and taking care of my son, it felt like I was going to have to juggle work and motherhood alone forever.
Romance seemed like a thing of the past until one day that March when Crystal saw a glimmer of hope.
My dad and I worked together, and I saw him and this guy, and I noticed that he was attractive, good-looking.
This is my daughter, Crystal. Oh, I don't think we've met before.
As Crystal's father introduced her to Tommy Garcia, one of her co-workers, she could tell right away that the 28-year-old was different.
The first thing I noticed was he was outgoing and nice.
And her instinct was confirmed over the next several weeks.
Tommy treated me really nice and sweet, and he would chat in his spare time at work. It seemed like he really liked me. I decided to show Tommy a picture of my son.
Oh my gosh, he has your eyes.
Tommy told me that he also had a young son. He was trying to get full custody of him. It gave Tommy and I a connection, and made me feel like he was a really good family guy.
A few weeks later, Crystal and Tommy were eager to take their idle office chit-chat off the clock.
We would spend time with my son and with his son. I was having a lot of fun, and we were really falling in love.
Over the next 4 months, the two became inseparable and decided to take the next step.
I love being here with you. What if I moved in here with you?
Of course. It was great to have someone you could finally connect with and help raise my son. Tommy was like a single mother's dream come true.
So when Tommy took Crystal out for a romantic dinner on March 29th, 2003, and popped the question,
Crystal, will you be my lawfully wedded wife?
Yeah.
she didn't have to think twice.
Tommy seemed to be nice and genuine. And he treated my grandson wonderfully. And I was very happy for both of them.
Although the lovebirds initially planned their nuptials for the following year, another joyous event soon eclipsed those plans.
About 6 months later, we found out we would be having a baby. So we decided to postpone the wedding.
In February of 2004, Crystal gave birth to another bouncing baby boy, while Tommy gained custody of his 6-year-old son and adopted Crystal's first child. And 1 year later, the two were united as one in a magical wedding ceremony.
I had the perfect dress, perfect cake, everything was perfect.
It was a very good wedding, very nice, perfect start to a family.
We were both really happy. But having all these kids, we needed a little bit more money, so I decided that I would work at a local pharmacy, and Tommy took a job at a landscaping company.
For the next 6 years, the Garcias lived busy lives with a full house. But in October 2011, Crystal started to notice a slight shift in Tommy's typically predictable behavior.
He started to have some weird problems with the car. He called me about an hour after work one day saying that he was going to get the tire fixed. And he said he would be home in about another half an hour.
And when Tommy came home late again the following week, citing more tire trouble, Crystal was puzzled.
He said, well, they must have never fixed it right the first time. I didn't have really any reason to doubt him, but I thought it was really weird.
Then, a few weeks later, things took an even stranger turn.
We were getting ready to head out for the day, and my son asked me for a toy out of the car. So I went to the car. I was looking for my son's toy. I saw this gun laying underneath the seat.
What are you doing?
In November 2011, after finding a gun in her husband Tommy's car, Crystal Garcia was starting to worry something was afoot.
What are you doing?
What is this?
It's nothing, all right? It's a pellet gun. It shoots air.
Tommy immediately got mad that I found it. And I said, what are you getting so mad about? Then he justified it, saying he played with it at work. I guess they would do different guy things during lunch. I thought they're all guys that work together. Maybe they do play with pellet guns, I don't know.
Why is it underneath the seat with all the toys? What if one of the kids had found it?
Look, it's nothing, all right? Just relax. I got it.
I thought it was kind of weird and suspicious that he was so mad about the situation.
Then, a few weeks later, as the couple attended a family event, Crystal noticed something creepy.
Tommy was talking to 2 young teenage girls, telling them that they were smart and beautiful.
Fill it out really nicely.
It seemed really inappropriate, and the girls felt a little uncomfortable by the advance he had made.
It turned the picnic into an awkward situation. I just found it very off base and unacceptable.
I felt embarrassed, so I confronted Tommy. He said that they'd taken it all wrong.
Come on, just pay them a cop.
That wasn't what he meant by it. He just justified it again, that everything was fine.
And on the night of February 15th, 2012, her husband's strange behavior reached its peak.
Tommy would play basketball with his friends, and he would usually come home around 10 o'clock at night, and it was getting to be 11:30 at night, and I started to get worried. And I was mad because he was out so late and he hadn't called.
Finally, Tommy walked in the door.
It's about time.
He was hyper, he was talking really fast. He was really excited. So I said, what are you doing coming home so late? He didn't think it was a big deal that he didn't call or anything. He said, I had to get the tire filled up with air. I was angry that it was another tire story. Just didn't really seem like it could be true.
Air in the tire.
Yeah, in the gas station. I found this phone.
Then he told me that he also found this phone by the air pump. He said it's a brand new phone. He said he checked in the gas station and they didn't know who it belonged to.
Nobody claimed it, so I figured one of our kids could use it.
Then he told me that he wanted to give our son the cell phone. I asked to look at the phone, but he wouldn't let me see it. He said that there was no information on it. It had been wiped clean. I thought it was kind of weird that there was this new phone that all the information had been erased from. I didn't really think it made sense.
Crystal told me Tommy was acting a little odd, and I told her just to keep her eyes open and make sure he's not just telling stories.
I found Tommy's behavior really confusing, and I didn't really know what to do to get to the bottom of it.
But Crystal wouldn't have to wait long.
The next night I was at work and I got a phone call.
Hello?
It was Tommy. He said that I needed to come home.
I need you to come home right away.
What's going on?
Miss Garcia?
Police officer got on the phone. I thought, oh my God.
In February 2012, after getting a call from her husband Tommy, Crystal Garcia was completely caught off guard when a police officer got on the line and said Tommy was being arrested.
The police officer said, you're gonna need to come home and watch the kids.
And then the police officer told her why.
What?
I was completely shocked, and I thought that there was some kind of mistake. I couldn't believe my husband could do that.
I'm on my way.
Her mind reeling, Crystal raced home.
I pulled onto our street. There was cop cars everywhere. My car was being seized. It was like something out of a movie. I was completely shocked, completely devastated that everything seemed to be falling apart right in front of me. The kids were in the window. Seeing the kids, the lights flashing, it was all like a nightmare. And my sons were looking at their father in handcuffs in front of the house. I felt that they shouldn't have to see something like that. They're probably scared.
Miss Garcia, you can't talk to him right now. We're going to process them.
The cops didn't let me say anything. They didn't let him talk. They just told him, kiss me goodbye.
The next morning, when Tommy called from jail, he assured his wife that it was all a huge misunderstanding.
He told me that he did know the woman, and he said, it's not what you think. I gave a girl a ride home once, and she'd made an advance, and he'd turned her down, and she was upset and accusing him of rape. I thought that was a little weird. But I felt like there was really no reason for me not to trust him. I just hoped that it was true what he was saying.
But when a detective showed up the next day, her faith in Tommy's story really began to wane.
He said, this girl who had been raped lost something, and we've been looking for it, and we can't seem to find it anywhere. And I said, oh my God.
Crystal's heart sank as she remembered Tommy giving their son a cell phone he said he found. And then the detective dropped a bombshell.
3 additional rape charges in place against Tommy.
Altogether, there's 4 rape charges and 2 kidnapping charges.
The detective explained that after Tommy's arrest, they discovered evidence that could tie him to 3 other rapes.
It felt like the whole world was crashing down. I was completely devastated. I couldn't believe that this could happen.
Crystal tried to stand on her own and try to muscle through it. She wanted to believe her husband was innocent. She wanted to believe that in the worst way.
I wanted to see what was really going on. So I got the police records at the county building, and I read the whole report.
Crystal was completely blindsided as she read that Tommy had admitted to being with all the victims. Devastated, she immediately confronted her husband at jail the next day.
I said, I just looked at the police report, and it says you admitted to the police that you were with all of these women.
You read her report.
Just trying to sabotage you, right?
I said, you told me that everybody was lying, the cops were lying, and this girl was lying. I said, at what point are you lying?
God, tell me the truth.
It was really the first moment where I knew he was lying.
Believe me.
I was really mad that not only that he'd done it, that he led me on to believe that he didn't do it. It was just coming to me all at once. I couldn't believe that he could do this to me, to the kids, to everybody. So I decided I was filing for a divorce. I felt like this is it. I'm done.
And as prosecutors prepared for Tommy's trial, Crystal would finally learn the whole truth. And it was more horrendous than she could have possibly imagined.
It was unbelievable.
This was just the tip of the iceberg.
It was just unreal to believe. I felt like I was with somebody I never knew.
In July of 2013, Crystal Garcia was still in shock when her husband Tommy went to trial for sexual battery and kidnapping and had been charged with 3 other possible rapes.
I had cried pretty much every day, like I couldn't believe that this had happened to me and happened to the kids.
In court, the horrible details of the crime finally came to light.
The night he came home from basketball with the cell phone, Tommy had been driving down the road and he saw a woman.
Tommy drove by this woman and asked her if she wanted a ride.
I said no.
He came back a second time. And she said no again.
I said, get in the car!
They drove up to the wooden area. He forced her out of the car and performed several sexual acts.
Then he took her phone so she wasn't able to call for help. And as she was driving away,
she was able to follow his taillights out of the area. She was able to flag down a motorist and call the police. She was able to give a description of the car and actually a description of the perpetrator. Police used that information to put together a DMV photo array from which she was able to identify Tommy Garcia.
Between the victim's testimony, her cell phone, and DNA evidence that conclusively linked him to the crimes, there was no denying Tommy was the rapist. On July 26, 2013, after 2 days of testimony, Tommy Garcia was found guilty on both counts.
it was completely crazy that he definitely did it, that this was him. It was just unreal to believe.
It's a shocking thing to think somebody you've been married to is someone like that, a monster.
On the same day as the verdict, Tommy Garcia was sentenced to 2 consecutive life sentences and labeled a sexual predator. 7 months later, he pled guilty to the 3 other rape cases and received a 15-year sentence.
I felt like I was with somebody I never knew. I was devastated. I couldn't believe that I'd married somebody that was capable of something so horrible.
Knowing the awful truth about her husband, Crystal couldn't help but wonder if there were even more victims out there.
The times when he was having car problems, I wonder if there was more to it.
And she could barely stomach thinking of the young girls he had flirted with.
I worry that when he looked at other young people that maybe he had ulterior motives.
It's really unusual for someone who rapes to not have a history of other kind of violent or aggressive behavior. But we are not surprised to find that there may be others, and we have to hope others who have been their victims will come forward.
Seems just so unreal that he was somebody that I lived with. You know, you lock your doors every night and try to keep the bad people out, and really, I just locked the bad person in.
Today, Crystal still struggles with why her husband would suddenly choose such a dark path after 6 years of marriage.
There weren't any signs. He had a good family. He was good for so long, but something was wrong. Something snapped inside of him. I don't think I'll ever have all the answers.
He had everyone fooled. My parents, my grandparents, the whole family.
But Crystal is determined to put all the painful memories behind her.
I now wonder, do you ever really know somebody? But I'm doing good, and the boys are happy. My life is going in the right direction.
The night air over Northern California carried the kind of silence that makes people uneasy without knowing why. The kind of silence where even the sound of distant traffic seems to fade into nothing. It was October 1999, and the small suburban neighborhood outside Sacramento had already gone to sleep. Porch lights glowed softly against rows of identical houses. Lawns freshly trimmed. Curtains drawn. The kind of quiet American street where nothing was supposed to happen. But sometime between 10:42 p.m. and midnight something did. Something that would haunt investigators for decades. Something that would turn an ordinary address into the center of one of California's most chilling cold cases. And for years, no one knew exactly what happened inside that house. Not the neighbors. Not the police. Not even the victim's own family. Until new forensic technology, decades later, would begin to uncover fragments of a truth buried in silence. But on that October night in 1999, none of that existed yet. There was only a phone call. At 12:17 a.m., emergency dispatch received a call from a frightened neighbor. The voice on the other end was shaky, barely controlled. She had heard something. A loud thud. Maybe two. Then what sounded like glass breaking. But the strangest part, the sound stopped abruptly. No shouting. No struggle. Just silence. Police arrived 12 minutes later. The front yard of the house looked perfectly normal. Lights were still on inside. The front door was slightly open. Not kicked in. Not broken. Just open. That detail would disturb detectives from the very beginning. Inside, the house looked frozen in time. A television still playing softly in the living room. A mug of tea on the coffee table. Steam long gone cold. The victim's purse lay near the couch. Keys inside. Wallet untouched. No sign of robbery. But then officers walked into the hallway. And everything changed. 27-year-old Melissa Carter was lying on the floor outside the bedroom. Face turned toward the ceiling. Eyes half open. A single dark stain spreading slowly beneath her. She had been stabbed once. Just once. But the wound was precise. Deep. Fatal. There were no signs of a prolonged fight. No overturned furniture. No broken lamps. Just one violent moment and then stillness. Detectives arriving at the scene immediately noticed something unsettling. The killer had been calm. Too calm. There were almost no fingerprints anywhere unusual. No weapon at the scene. No forced entry. And perhaps the most chilling detail of all. Melissa's dog, a normally loud and territorial golden retriever, was found sitting quietly in the kitchen. Alive. Unharmed. Not barking. Almost as if the dog had known whoever entered that house. Investigators quickly began piecing together Melissa Carter's life. And on the surface, everything seemed ordinary. She worked as a dental hygienist at a small clinic in downtown Sacramento. No criminal history. No known enemies. Friends described her as cheerful, organized, predictable. The kind of person who planned weekend hikes weeks in advance. The kind of person who always called her mother every Sunday. Her co-workers said she had left work that Friday in good spirits. She even made plans to attend a friend's birthday party the next evening. Nothing suggested she feared for her safety. Nothing suggested she was in danger. Which only deepened the mystery. Because whoever killed Melissa Carter had not broken in. They had been allowed inside. The investigation quickly turned toward the people closest to her. Friends. Family. Co-workers. Neighbors. And one name surfaced almost immediately. Jason Walker. Melissa's ex-boyfriend. The breakup had happened just 3 months earlier. According to friends, it had not ended peacefully. Witnesses described arguments. Emotional phone calls. Late-night confrontations outside Melissa's house. When detectives interviewed Jason, he appeared nervous but cooperative. He admitted the breakup had been difficult. But he insisted he had not seen Melissa for weeks. His alibi seemed solid. At the time of the murder, he was reportedly attending a late movie with 2 friends across town. Ticket stubs confirmed it. So did surveillance footage from the theater lobby. Investigators could not place him anywhere near the crime scene. Jason Walker walked out of the police station that night a free man. And just like that, the most obvious suspect disappeared from the board. Meanwhile, detectives began canvassing the neighborhood. One neighbor reported seeing a car parked down the street earlier that evening. Dark-colored. Possibly a sedan. But they could not recall the license plate. Another resident remembered hearing footsteps running along the sidewalk around midnight. But when officers asked which direction the person ran, the answer was always the same. I couldn't see anything. No one saw a face. No one saw a weapon. No one saw Melissa's killer leave. Then investigators discovered something odd. Melissa's phone records. At 10:38 p.m., just minutes before the estimated time of the attack, she had received a call. The call lasted only 14 seconds. Short. Abrupt. The number belonged to a prepaid cell phone. Unregistered. Impossible to trace. Detectives believed Melissa had opened the door for whoever called. But why? And how did the killer know she would answer? Inside the house, forensic teams worked for hours under bright lights. Dusting. Swabbing. Cataloging every microscopic detail. But 1999 forensic science had limits. DNA technology was still developing. Touch DNA was barely understood. The lab collected several samples from the crime scene. But none produced a clear match in existing databases. The case slowly began to stall. Weeks turned into months. Months into years. Detectives followed dozens of leads. A co-worker who seemed overly interested in Melissa's personal life. A stranger seen walking a dog near the neighborhood that evening. An anonymous letter mailed to the police station claiming the killer was closer than they think. But every lead ended the same way. Nothing. No charges. No arrests. No answers. By 2003, the case officially became what investigators dread most. A cold case. Melissa Carter's file was moved into a storage cabinet with thousands of others. Boxed. Labeled. Forgotten by the public. But not by the family. Her mother kept Melissa's bedroom exactly as it had been. Clothes still hanging in the closet. Hiking boots by the door. Birthday cards stacked neatly on the dresser. Every year on the anniversary of Melissa's death, the family called the police department asking the same question. Is there anything new? And every year the answer was the same. No. But something about the case continued to bother the original detectives. One detail. One small inconsistency. The dog. Golden retrievers are known for their friendly nature. But even friendly dogs react when strangers enter the home at night. Barking. Growling. At the very least alert. Melissa's dog had done none of that. Which meant one of two things. Either the killer was someone the dog knew, or the killer had been inside that house before. And that possibility opened a terrifying door. Because if the killer was someone familiar, then someone in Melissa Carter's life had been hiding a deadly secret for years. And they had gotten away with it. For more than 2 decades. Until technology began to catch up with the past. Until forgotten evidence was pulled from a dusty shelf. Until a tiny fragment of DNA, once invisible, began whispering the truth. But in 1999, none of that had happened yet. At that time, the case simply faded into silence. A young woman murdered in her own home. A killer who vanished without a trace. And a quiet California street where neighbors still remember the night police lights painted the houses red and blue. A night when the calm suburban silence was shattered. And a mystery was born. A mystery that would wait more than 20 years before the first real crack appeared. The years that followed the murder of Melissa Carter settled over the investigation like a slow, suffocating fog. At first, detectives still believed the break would come quickly. Cases like this often did. Someone talked. Someone slipped. Someone made a mistake. But weeks stretched into months, and months hardened into years, and the promise of an easy answer quietly dissolved. The file grew thicker, statements, reports, photographs, lab notes, but the truth remained just beyond reach, buried somewhere inside a story no one could fully see. In the early days of the investigation, detectives circled back repeatedly to the same unsettling detail. Melissa had opened the door willingly. There had been no forced entry, no shattered lock, no sign of panic before the attack. Whoever stood on that doorstep that night was not a stranger in the usual sense. Either she knew the person well enough to trust them, or she believed there was no reason to be afraid. That single fact reshaped the direction of the investigation. The focus tightened around Melissa's inner circle. Detectives interviewed friends again and again, each conversation combed for subtle shifts in tone, for hesitation, for inconsistencies that might reveal something hidden beneath polite grief. Melissa's co-workers described her routine in careful detail, her lunch breaks, her habit of staying late to finish paperwork, the way she sometimes stopped for coffee at the same cafe every afternoon. None of it suggested danger. None of it hinted at enemies. Yet one story surfaced repeatedly. Over the weeks before her death, several friends recalled Melissa mentioning something strange. Nothing dramatic, nothing that seemed threatening at the time. Just a vague sense that someone had been watching her. She mentioned seeing the same car twice in the parking lot near her apartment complex. A dark sedan. Parked across the street. Engine off. Driver unseen. At the time, she laughed it off. Said it was probably a neighbor or someone waiting for a friend. But one coworker remembered a moment when Melissa didn't laugh. It was during lunch at a small sandwich shop near the dental clinic. Melissa had looked through the front window toward the street, then gone quiet for a few seconds. When her friend asked what was wrong, she simply said, "Maybe I'm just being paranoid." Those words echoed strangely in the police reports. Because after Melissa's murder, investigators began searching for that car. But descriptions were vague. Some witnesses said dark blue. Others insisted black. A few thought it might have been green under certain light. Without a license plate or clear description, the lead dissolved almost immediately. Meanwhile, detectives continued examining Melissa's personal life. Her bank records revealed nothing unusual. No large withdrawals. No unexplained transactions. Her email accounts contained routine conversations, family messages, work schedules, weekend plans. Even her handwritten calendar looked ordinary, filled with dentist appointments and reminders to buy groceries. But one name continued drifting back into conversations. Jason Walker. The ex-boyfriend. He had been cleared early in the investigation, but something about the breakup lingered in witness statements. Friends described their relationship as intense, sometimes volatile. Jason had been deeply invested in Melissa's life, perhaps too invested. After the breakup, he reportedly struggled to accept the distance she created. Detectives decided to revisit him. This time, the interview lasted longer. Jason appeared calmer than during the first questioning. He answered every question without hesitation. He admitted the relationship had been emotional. Yes, they argued. Yes, he had tried to contact her several times after the breakup. But he insisted the relationship ended weeks before her death, and he claimed he had begun seeing someone new. Investigators asked him about the mysterious phone call Melissa received just before the murder. 14 seconds. Jason said it wasn't him. Phone records seemed to support that claim. His cell phone activity placed him across town near the movie theater where he had been that night. But detectives noticed something small in the timeline. The call to Melissa's house came from a prepaid phone. And prepaid phones were almost impossible to track in 1999. It meant anyone could have used it. Anyone who didn't want to be traced. The investigators left the interview with the same frustrating conclusion they had reached before: suspicion without proof. And suspicion was not enough. Months later, another piece of the puzzle surfaced. A delivery driver who had been working in the neighborhood the night of the murder contacted the police after seeing a news segment about the case. At first, his story seemed uncertain, like a memory struggling to hold shape. But as detectives listened, they realized he might have seen something important. The driver remembered stopping his van near Melissa's Street around 11:15 p.m. while checking directions for a delivery. As he sat in the vehicle, he noticed someone walking quickly along the sidewalk. A man. Tall. Wearing a dark jacket. The man seemed to glance back over his shoulder several times, as if checking whether someone was following him. The driver didn't see the man's face clearly. Streetlights were sparse, and the figure disappeared behind a row of trees within seconds. But there was one detail that stuck in the driver's memory. The man wasn't running. He was walking very fast but controlled. Like someone trying not to draw attention. Detectives mapped the driver's location. If the timeline was correct, the man could have left Melissa's house minutes earlier. But once again, there was no face, no name, no clear identity. The lead faded like the others. Years passed. The case cooled. Detectives were reassigned. Some retired. New investigators inherited the file but struggled to find new angles. Technology had advanced slightly, but the evidence collected in 1999 remained limited. DNA samples from the scene existed, but they were partial profiles, too incomplete to match anyone in the national database. The evidence waited silently in storage, its potential locked behind the limits of old technology. Then something unexpected happened. In 2015, a cold case unit in Northern California began reviewing unsolved homicides from the late 1990s. Advances in forensic science had begun transforming investigations across the country. Cases once considered hopeless were suddenly producing new leads thanks to improvements in DNA analysis. Melissa Carter's case was pulled from the archive. Detectives opened the box again. Photographs. Evidence bags. Lab reports. And inside a sealed container, one small item caught their attention. A fragment of fabric recovered from the hallway near Melissa's body. Back in 1999, the material had been tested for fingerprints but revealed nothing usable. At the time, analysts believed it might have come from Melissa's own clothing or furniture. But with modern forensic techniques, even tiny traces of skin cells could reveal DNA profiles that once seemed impossible to detect. The investigators decided to test it again. Weeks later, the lab called with an unexpected result. There was DNA on the fabric. Not Melissa's. Someone else's. For the first time in 16 years, the case had produced something real. Something that belonged to the killer. But the discovery came with a painful twist. The DNA profile did not match anyone in the National Criminal Database. Which meant the person responsible had likely never been arrested for a serious crime. The killer had been living somewhere out there, quietly moving through life. Working. Eating dinner. Walking past neighbors who had no idea what they had done. And the DNA fragment sitting in that evidence bag was the only thing tying them to the murder. Detectives now faced a new challenge. They had the killer's genetic signature. But no name to match it. Unless technology could reach further into the past than anyone had imagined. Unless the answer had been hiding in places investigators never looked before. Because somewhere in California someone carried the same bloodline as the man who walked out of Melissa Carter's house that night. And soon, a revolutionary new forensic technique would begin tracing that bloodline backward through time, one family branch at a time. The silence that had protected the killer for decades was beginning to crack. But no one yet realized how shocking the truth would be when it finally emerged. The discovery of the unknown DNA profile did not bring immediate answers. In fact, in many ways, it deepened the mystery. Investigators now possessed something they had never had before, a biological trace left by the killer, but that trace floated in a vacuum. No name. No criminal record. No match inside any database law enforcement had access to. It was like holding a key without knowing which door it belonged to. Still, the atmosphere around the case began to change. For years, Melissa Carter's murder had been a silent file collecting dust in a climate-controlled evidence room. Now the box sat open on a conference table inside the cold case unit. Detectives leaned over photographs that had once been examined by officers in another era, grainy images from disposable cameras, snapshots of the quiet suburban hallway where Melissa had taken her final breath. They studied the photos with fresh eyes, as if the truth might reveal itself in the details overlooked decades earlier. The DNA profile recovered from the fabric fragment was small but viable. Modern analysis had extracted enough genetic information to construct a partial profile more than investigators in 1999 could ever have hoped for. But a partial profile still meant limitations. It could point toward a family line, perhaps even a geographic background, but it could not instantly identify a specific person. That was when one of the forensic analysts proposed something radical. Investigative genetic genealogy. At the time, the technique was still new, still controversial, and still unfamiliar to many departments. It had only recently gained attention after helping solve several high-profile cold cases. Instead of searching criminal databases, investigators would upload the unknown DNA profile into public genealogy databases, websites where ordinary people submitted their genetic data to trace their ancestry. If the killer had a distant relative who had used one of those services, even unknowingly, the DNA might create a connection. A cousin. A third cousin. Maybe even a fourth. From there, genealogists could begin building family trees. Branch by branch. Generation by generation. Until eventually the branches narrowed down to a single individual who could have been present in California in 1999. It was a painstaking process. But it had worked before. Detectives approved the plan. The DNA profile from the evidence bag, once a meaningless fragment, was prepared for genealogy analysis. Weeks passed while technicians converted the data into a format compatible with the public databases. When the upload finally happened, the investigators understood something important. They were no longer looking for a suspect. They were looking for a family. Days later, the first results appeared. Not a direct match, but several distant connections. The closest one shared about 2% of the unknown DNA. That suggested a possible third cousin relationship. The genealogists began their work. They mapped the shared genetic segments between the unknown profile and the individuals who appeared in the database. Then they started tracing those individuals backward through time, marriage records, birth certificates, census archives, immigration documents, obituary notices. The process felt more like historical research than police work. Slow. Meticulous. Sometimes frustrating. But slowly, patterns began to form. The shared DNA connections pointed toward a cluster of families whose roots traced back to the American Midwest in the early 20th century. Several branches of the tree eventually migrated west during the 1950s and 1960s. California. Nevada. Oregon. One of those branches caught the genealogist's attention. A family that had settled in Northern California by the late 1970s. The timeline fit. If a male descendant from that branch had been born in the early 1970s, he would have been in his mid-20s around 1999, the same approximate age investigators believed Melissa's killer might have been. But the family tree was large. Dozens of possible names. Brothers. Cousins. Second cousins once removed. Each one a potential candidate. Each one living a life somewhere beyond the knowledge of detectives studying their ancestry. Investigators now faced a different kind of puzzle. Instead of hunting a single suspect, they had to narrow down an entire bloodline. They began filtering the names. First, geography. Who among these relatives had lived in Northern California around 1999? Then age. Who would have been between 20 and 35 at the time of the murder? Then criminal history. Traffic violations. Minor arrests. Any interaction with law enforcement that might place them inside official records. Slowly, the list began shrinking. 40 names became 20. 20 became 12. And eventually 5. 5 men connected by distant family ties, each sharing enough DNA to potentially link them to the evidence recovered from Melissa Carter's home. 5 men who had lived somewhere in California in 1999. 5 men who had never been considered suspects before. The cold case unit studied each one carefully. The first candidate had moved to Arizona years earlier and had a stable job working in construction. His records showed no connection to Sacramento in the late 90s. The second had been serving in the military overseas during the time of the murder. The third had died in a car accident in 2007. The fourth had lived nearly 400 miles away and had no apparent reason to be near Melissa's neighborhood. That left one final name. A man who had lived less than 30 miles from Melissa Carter's home in 1999. His name was Daniel Harlan. 30 years old at the time of the review. 24 at the time of the murder. He worked as a warehouse logistics coordinator for a regional distribution company. No violent criminal history. No prior connection to Melissa Carter that investigators could immediately see. At first glance, he seemed unremarkable. But when detectives began examining his past more closely, something strange appeared. In the late 1990s, Daniel Harlan had lived temporarily in an apartment complex only 2 miles from Melissa's house. And during that same period, he had held a part-time job delivering office supplies throughout Sacramento. Deliveries that often brought him into residential neighborhoods. Sometimes late in the evening. Investigators looked at each other across the conference table. The possibility was chilling. If Daniel Harlan had ever delivered supplies near Melissa's home, he might have noticed her routine. Her schedule. Her house. He might have seen when she returned from work. When she walked her dog. When she turned on the porch light at night. And if he had noticed those things, he might have known exactly when to approach that front door. But suspicion was not proof. The genealogy results suggested a genetic connection. But they still needed direct confirmation. The only way to do that was to obtain Daniel Harlan's DNA and compare it to the evidence from the crime scene. Quietly. Without alerting him. Detectives began surveillance. They watched his house from unmarked vehicles. They followed him to work. They waited for the moment he discarded something containing his DNA. A coffee cup. A soda can. A cigarette. Days passed. Then weeks. Finally, one evening outside a grocery store parking lot, investigators saw their opportunity. Daniel Harlan stepped out of his car holding a plastic water bottle. He finished the last sip as he walked toward the entrance and tossed the empty bottle into a trash can near the door. Detectives waited until he disappeared inside the store. Then one of them walked casually to the trash can and retrieved the bottle. Inside the vehicle, they sealed it in an evidence bag. For the first time since 1999, investigators believed they might be holding the identity of Melissa Carter's killer. But as the DNA analysis began back at the lab, another unsettling thought crept into the minds of the detectives who had reopened the case. Because if Daniel Harlan truly was the man whose DNA appeared at the murder scene, then he had lived more than 20 years of normal life after that night. 20 years of freedom. 20 years of silence. And somewhere within those 2 decades might be hidden a motive so dark, so unexpected, that no one in Melissa's quiet neighborhood had ever imagined it. The answer was finally close. Closer than it had ever been. But the truth, when it arrived, would shake the case in ways investigators were not prepared for. The water bottle sat inside a sealed evidence bag under the sterile lights of the forensic laboratory, a simple piece of plastic that might finally speak for a victim whose voice had been silenced more than 2 decades earlier. Detectives who had spent months retracing the shadows of a long-forgotten crime now found themselves waiting again, but this waiting felt different. In 1999, they had waited for witnesses who never came forward, for lab results that revealed nothing, for leads that dissolved in the daylight. Now they were waiting for science, modern, relentless science, to answer a question that had haunted a family and an entire community. Technicians worked quietly inside the lab, swabbing the mouth of the bottle where Daniel Harlan's lips had touched the plastic. The process itself was routine: extract the DNA, isolate the genetic markers, build a profile that could be compared against the partial profile recovered from the hallway outside Melissa Carter's bedroom. But the stakes were anything but routine. For the investigators who had reopened the case, this comparison was the dividing line between theory and reality. Outside the lab, life continued as if nothing had changed. Daniel Harlan went to work each morning at the warehouse distribution center on the edge of Sacramento. Co-workers described him as quiet, punctual, reliable. The kind of employee who rarely called in sick and rarely spoke about his personal life. He had worked there for nearly a decade, gradually moving into a supervisory role overseeing shipping schedules and inventory logistics. Nothing about his professional record suggested violence. Nothing hinted that the man who coordinated pallets of consumer goods might also carry the secret of a murder. Neighbors in the modest apartment complex where he lived described a similar pattern. Polite greetings in the hallway. Occasional small talk near the mailboxes. He kept to himself, rarely hosted visitors, and spent many evenings alone inside his unit. One neighbor mentioned that he sometimes went jogging late at night along the nearby bike path. Another said he often left for work before sunrise. Ordinary details. An ordinary life. And that ordinariness unsettled the detectives more than anything else. Because if Daniel Harlan was the killer, then he had managed something terrifyingly simple: he had blended in. He had lived quietly for more than 20 years without raising suspicion, without drawing attention, without ever appearing on the radar of law enforcement. Meanwhile, the DNA comparison moved forward. Forensic analysts processed the sample taken from the water bottle and built a full genetic profile. Once completed, they began aligning that profile against the fragment recovered from the fabric near Melissa's body. The lab computers compared marker after marker. Each genetic location examined. Each allele measured. The analysts knew the mathematics behind what they were doing. A complete match across multiple markers would not merely suggest a connection, it would place Daniel Harlan at the crime scene with a statistical certainty so high that coincidence would become virtually impossible. But science has its own rhythm. The analysis took time. Days stretched into nearly 2 weeks. During that time, detectives maintained quiet surveillance of Harlan. They could not arrest him without the DNA confirmation, and they did not want him to sense that investigators had begun circling his life. Every move had to remain invisible. One evening, 2 detectives sat in an unmarked car across from Harlan's apartment building, watching the dim glow of lights through the windows. The complex looked unremarkable: 2-story buildings arranged around a cracked parking lot, the occasional flicker of a television visible through thin curtains. Children rode bicycles along the sidewalk earlier in the afternoon, their laughter echoing between the buildings. Now the night had settled, and the place felt quiet. One of the detectives studied Harlan through binoculars as he carried groceries from his car into the building. "He doesn't look like someone who's been hiding a murder for 20 years, the detective murmured. His partner answered without looking up from the case file resting on his lap. "Most of them don't." Inside the forensic lab, the results finally arrived. The match was conclusive. The DNA collected from Daniel Harlan's discarded water bottle matched the DNA recovered from the fabric fragment at Melissa Carter's crime scene. Not partial. Not probable. Exact. Statistically, the likelihood of another person sharing that genetic profile was astronomically small. After 21 years, the investigation had finally placed a specific human being inside the hallway where Melissa Carter died. Detectives sat in silence when the lab director delivered the report. For a moment, no one spoke. Then the room seemed to shift all at once, the stillness breaking into motion as investigators began preparing the next phase of the operation. Warrants were drafted. Evidence logs were reviewed. The cold case file that once gathered dust now sat at the center of a full investigative team. But even with the DNA confirmation, a critical question remained unanswered. Why? Why had Daniel Harlan killed Melissa Carter? The detectives combed through every known connection between the two. At first, nothing obvious appeared. No shared workplace. No mutual friends. No overlapping social circles. But when investigators revisited Harlan's employment records from the late 1990s, another detail surfaced. During his early 20s, before joining the warehouse company, Harlan had briefly worked for a regional office supply distributor. A job that involved evening deliveries. Sometimes to residential neighborhoods. And among the archived delivery routes from 1999, investigators discovered something chilling. One of the routes passed directly through Melissa Carter's neighborhood. It was not a daily route, but records showed that drivers occasionally delivered late shipments to small home offices or freelance clients living in the area. That meant Harlan might have driven past Melissa's house several times. Perhaps many times. Enough times to notice patterns. Enough times to recognize the young woman who lived alone with a golden retriever. Enough times to see when the porch light came on. When the car pulled into the driveway. When the house fell quiet at night. Detectives began constructing a new theory. What if Melissa Carter had never known Daniel Harlan personally? What if she had only seen him in passing? A delivery driver at the door. A brief exchange. A polite thank you. The kind of interaction that barely registers in memory. But for Harlan, perhaps the interaction meant something more. Something obsessive. Something that grew slowly in silence. The idea chilled the investigators. Because it suggested the murder might not have been spontaneous. It might have been planned. Carefully. Patiently. For weeks. Or even months. The mysterious phone call at 10:38 p.m. suddenly took on new meaning. If Harlan had used a prepaid phone to call Melissa's house, he might have done it for a simple reason, to make sure she was home before approaching the door. 14 seconds. Long enough to hear her voice. Long enough to confirm she was alone. Then the knock at the door. Melissa, believing it might be someone she recognized or perhaps a neighbor needing help, opens it. The dog does not bark. Perhaps the man smells familiar from previous deliveries. Perhaps he speaks calmly. Perhaps he asks a simple question. Then something goes wrong. Or perhaps something had been wrong all along. Investigators could not yet know the full sequence of events that unfolded inside that house. But one fact had become unavoidable. Daniel Harlan's DNA was there. Inside the hallway where Melissa Carter died. The case that had once been a mystery was beginning to solidify into something far more disturbing. A killer who had walked away from the crime scene in 1999. A man who had lived more than 2 decades under the illusion that his secret would remain buried forever. And now, for the first time since that October night, the silence protecting him was finally collapsing. Detectives prepared the arrest warrant carefully. There would be no mistakes. No warnings. Because the next time Daniel Harlan stepped outside his apartment, he would no longer be just another quiet man walking through the Sacramento night. He would be the prime suspect in one of California's most haunting cold cases. And within hours, the calm routine of his life would shatter in exactly the same way Melissa Carter's quiet evening had shattered 21 years earlier. The arrest operation began before sunrise, when the quiet apartment complex still sat in that fragile hour between night and morning, the time when most people remain asleep and the world feels briefly suspended. Detectives had chosen the timing carefully. Surprise mattered. Control mattered even more. After more than 2 decades, they were not about to risk a suspect slipping away because of a poorly planned moment. Unmarked police vehicles rolled silently into position along the street outside Daniel Harlan's building. The engines idled softly, headlights off. Officers stepped out one by one, moving with the quiet coordination that comes from long experience. Bulletproof vests. Radios clipped low. A warrant folded inside a pocket. Inside apartment 204, Daniel Harlan had no idea that the past was about to arrive at his door. At 5:47 a.m., the team moved. 2 detectives approached the stairwell. Another positioned himself near the rear exit of the building. A 3rd officer remained in the parking lot, watching the narrow rows of parked cars in case anyone attempted to drive away. The hallway outside Harlan's apartment smelled faintly of detergent and old carpet. The fluorescent light overhead flickered once before stabilizing. 1 detective knocked firmly. 3 sharp raps. For several seconds, nothing happened. Then footsteps. Slow. Groggy. The sound of a lock turning. The door opened halfway, and Daniel Harlan appeared in the frame wearing a gray t-shirt and sweatpants, his hair disheveled from sleep. For a brief moment he looked confused, his eyes adjusting to the figures standing in the hallway. "Daniel Harlan?" one detective asked. "Yes. We have a warrant for your arrest." The words seemed to freeze the air. For an instant, Harlan's expression showed something subtle, something that detectives would later replay in their minds many times. It wasn't pure confusion. It wasn't shock. It was something closer to recognition. As if a distant possibility he had buried long ago had suddenly stepped back into the room. He didn't run. He didn't argue. He simply stood there, staring. Then he said quietly, "For what?" The detective's voice remained calm. "For the murder of Melissa Carter." The name hung in the hallway like a ghost finally given form. For a second, Harlan's face tightened. A small reaction, barely visible, but unmistakable to the investigators watching him. The moment passed quickly, replaced by a blank expression. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said. The detectives had heard that sentence before. Many times. They placed him in handcuffs and escorted him down the stairs while neighbors peeked through half-open doors, their morning routines interrupted by the sight of police leading away a man many of them barely knew. Outside, the sky was beginning to lighten with the first hint of dawn. Daniel Harlan was placed into the back of a police vehicle. And just like that, the man who had quietly lived among them for years disappeared behind tinted glass. Back at the police station, the interrogation room waited. A small space with plain walls, a metal table, 2 chairs, and a camera mounted high in the corner. Detectives placed a folder on the table containing photographs from the 1999 crime scene, DNA reports, and the reconstructed genealogy tree that had led them to Harlan's bloodline. The man himself sat calmly, hands folded in front of him. The detectives noticed something unusual immediately. He didn't seem nervous. If anything, he looked almost resigned. The lead investigator began slowly. "Daniel, we've reopened the case involving Melissa Carter." No response. "You remember her name?" Harlan looked down at the table. "I don't know anyone named Melissa Carter." The detective opened the folder and slid a photograph across the table. Melissa's face stared back from the image, frozen in a smiling portrait taken years before her death. Harlan glanced at it briefly, then looked away. "I've never seen her before." The detectives expected denial. What they were more interested in was the DNA. The investigator leaned forward slightly. Daniel, we recovered DNA from the crime scene in 1999. That DNA matches you. Silence. The words settled heavily in the room. Harlan's eyes remained fixed on the tabletop. You're wrong, he said quietly. The detective placed the laboratory report beside the photograph. We collected your DNA from a water bottle you threw away last week. The match is confirmed. Your DNA was inside Melissa Carter's house the night she was murdered. For the first time, Harlan looked up directly at the investigators. There was no panic in his face. No anger. Just a long, quiet stare. Then he leaned back in the chair. That doesn't mean I killed her. It was a calculated answer. A shift in strategy. The detectives noticed immediately. Minutes earlier, he had claimed he had never seen Melissa Carter before. Now he was acknowledging the possibility that his DNA might somehow have been inside her house. The contradiction hung in the air. Then explain how it got there, the investigator said. Harlan shrugged slightly. I used to deliver supplies back then. Maybe I went to the wrong house once. Maybe she opened the door. Maybe I handed her a package. The explanation sounded rehearsed. Prepared. But the detectives knew something he didn't. The DNA found at the scene wasn't on a delivery receipt. It wasn't on a doorknob. It was on a fabric fragment discovered inside the hallway where Melissa Carter collapsed after being stabbed. That fact changed everything. The lead detective placed another photograph on the table. This one taken inside the hallway in 1999. The dark stain on the carpet. The exact spot where Melissa had died. We found your DNA right here, he said quietly. Harlan stared at the image. A long silence followed. 30 seconds. Then a minute. The ticking of a wall clock somewhere outside the room filled the space. Finally, Harlan spoke. I want a lawyer. The interrogation stopped immediately. Detectives leaned back in their chairs, watching him carefully. Because even though the confession had not come, something important had happened in that room. Daniel Harlan had shifted from denial to defense. And that shift told investigators something powerful. He knew they had him. But what they still didn't know was the one piece of the story that mattered most. The motive. Why Melissa Carter? Why that night? Why the quiet suburban house where nothing was supposed to happen? As Daniel Harlan was escorted out of the interrogation room to await formal charges, detectives returned to the case file once more. They studied the photographs again. The hallway. The overturned rug. The single fatal wound. And the dog sitting quietly in the kitchen. Somewhere inside those details lay the final piece of the puzzle. Because even after 21 years, even after DNA and genealogy and surveillance and arrest, the most chilling question of all remained unanswered. What had actually happened in that house during those final moments? And why had Melissa Carter opened the door to the man who would end her life? The news spread through Sacramento before noon. A single headline appeared on local television screens and news websites, then multiplied across social media feeds, radio broadcasts, and evening bulletins like a shockwave rolling through the city. 1999 California cold case arrest, suspect finally in custody after 21 years. For many people, the story arrived as a sudden curiosity. A crime from another era resurfacing in the present, a mystery unexpectedly reopened by modern science. But for those who had lived through the original investigation, the announcement landed like a memory clawing its way back to life. Neighbors from Melissa Carter's old street began calling reporters. Former co-workers from the dental clinic exchanged messages in disbelief. Some of them had moved away years ago. Others had built families, changed careers, grown older in the quiet rhythm of life. Yet the moment they heard her name again, they remembered exactly where they had been the night everything changed. The quiet neighborhood. The flashing police lights. The uneasy realization that something terrible had happened just a few doors away. Now, more than 2 decades later, the case that once seemed destined to remain unsolved had suddenly produced a suspect. But the story was far from finished. Inside the county jail, Daniel Harlan sat alone in a holding cell waiting for his first court appearance. The room was bare except for a steel bench and a small window set high in the wall. The silence inside that space felt different from the silence of his apartment or his solitary evening jogs. This silence had weight. It pressed in from all sides. Investigators knew something else had changed as well. The arrest had moved the case from the quiet world of cold case detectives into the bright glare of the criminal justice system. Every step from this point forward would unfold in public view courtrooms, evidence hearings, legal arguments that would dissect every piece of the investigation. But the detectives who had worked the case still carried a deeper question that no courtroom document could easily answer. What had actually happened inside Melissa Carter's house? The evidence told only fragments of the story. Melissa had been stabbed once in the chest with a sharp blade. The wound was precise, direct to the heart. Forensic pathologists believed the attacker had either known exactly where to strike or had acted with sudden, decisive force. There were no defensive wounds on Melissa's arms or hands. That detail disturbed investigators from the beginning. It suggested she might not have expected the attack, or that it had happened too quickly for her to react. Inside the hallway, investigators had found only limited signs of struggle: a slightly displaced rug, a small scratch along the wooden doorframe, and the fragment of dark fabric that ultimately carried Daniel Harlan's DNA. The dog had not barked. Neighbors had heard no screams. It was as if the entire event had unfolded within seconds. A quiet moment. A single movement. Then silence. Now that Harlan sat in custody, detectives began reconstructing the timeline once again. October 12, 1999. 10:38 p.m., the mysterious 14-second phone call to Melissa's house. Sometime shortly after, a knock at the door. Then the murder. Investigators returned to the prepaid phone theory. If Harlan had used a disposable phone to call Melissa that night, it suggested preparation. A deliberate act meant to confirm she was home before approaching. But preparation for what? Robbery did not make sense. Nothing had been taken from the house. Jewelry remained untouched. Her wallet sat on the kitchen counter exactly where she had left it earlier that evening. Burglary seemed equally unlikely. Experienced burglars did not knock on the door before entering. Which left only darker possibilities. Obsession. Rejection. Or a motive so personal it had remained invisible for decades. Meanwhile, detectives dug deeper into Daniel Harlan's past. They reviewed old employment files, tax records, addresses, and archived documents from the late 1990s. The portrait that emerged was strangely ordinary. Born in 1975 in a small town outside Reno. Moved to Northern California in his early 20s. Worked a series of modest jobs: warehouse labor, delivery driver, inventory clerk. No arrests for violent crime. Only minor traffic citations. Speeding. Parking violations. Nothing that would suggest a man capable of murder. But investigators understood something about violent offenders that the public often misunderstood. Many killers lived ordinary lives. They paid bills. Went to work. Smiled politely at neighbors. The darkness existed beneath the surface, hidden behind routines that made them appear unremarkable. Still, detectives searched for anything unusual in Harlan's history. A restraining order. A complaint. A past relationship that ended badly. One former co-worker eventually provided a small but unsettling memory. Back in the late 90s, when Harlan worked delivery routes for the office supply company, he sometimes talked about customers in ways that made others uncomfortable. Nothing explicit. Just comments that lingered longer than they should have. One co-worker remembered him mentioning a girl with the golden dog who lived somewhere along one of the suburban routes. At the time, the remark had sounded like casual conversation. But now investigators wondered whether that description had been referring to Melissa Carter. Because Melissa did have a golden retriever. And she did live along one of those delivery routes. If Harlan had noticed her repeatedly during deliveries, something could have grown inside his mind, a fixation built from brief encounters, silent observations, imagined familiarity. That theory raised another possibility. Perhaps Melissa had seen him before. Not as a friend. Not even as someone she knew. But as a familiar face from deliveries in the neighborhood. A man who occasionally knocked on doors carrying packages. A man whose presence might not trigger immediate fear. Which could explain why she opened the door that night. But there was still something investigators could not reconcile. If the murder had been planned, why only one strike? Why such a sudden, efficient attack? Most planned crimes involved control, confrontation, escalation. Yet the evidence inside the house suggested something closer to a single violent moment that ended almost immediately. Almost like panic. Or anger. Or rejection. When detectives revisited the phone records again, another subtle possibility surfaced. What if the 14-second phone call had not simply confirmed Melissa was home? What if it had been an attempt to speak with her? Perhaps Harlan called, expecting her to recognize his voice. Perhaps he believed she would agree to see him. Perhaps she hung up. And perhaps that rejection turned whatever plan he had imagined into something darker. No one could yet prove that theory. But the pieces began to align in disturbing ways. Meanwhile, the community where Melissa once lived experienced a strange return of unease. 4 years, the murder had faded into memory, an unresolved tragedy slowly absorbed by time. Now reporters stood once again at the edge of the same quiet street, filming segments beneath the same streetlights that had illuminated police tape 21 years earlier. Residents spoke cautiously to cameras. Some expressed relief. Others expressed shock. One elderly neighbor who had lived there since the 1990s said something that lingered with the reporters. "We always thought whoever did this disappeared forever," she said softly. "Turns out he might have been living right here all along." The realization carried a chilling implication. For 2 decades, the man now accused of Melissa Carter's murder had existed somewhere in the same region. Driving the same highways. Shopping in the same stores. Walking past strangers who had no idea they were crossing paths with someone tied to an unsolved killing. But even with the arrest, the story remained incomplete. Because Daniel Harlan had not confessed. He had not explained the phone call. He had not explained why his DNA appeared inside Melissa's hallway. And until the full truth emerged, the case remained suspended between science and silence. A cold case cracked open by technology. A suspect finally identified. But the final moments of Melissa Carter's life still hidden somewhere inside the mind of the man now sitting alone in a jail cell. A man who had kept his secret for 21 years. And who, even now, showed no sign that he intended to reveal it. The courtroom filled quickly on the morning of Daniel Harlan's first hearing. Reporters lined the back rows, notebooks open, cameras waiting outside the double doors. For many of them, the story had already become irresistible, a cold case buried for decades suddenly pulled into the present by DNA technology, the quiet suspect who had lived unnoticed among ordinary people, the young woman whose death had never fully left the memory of Sacramento. At the defense table, Daniel Harlan sat beside a public defender appointed only hours earlier. He wore the standard county jail uniform, his hands resting calmly on the table, his posture composed. If he felt the weight of the room's attention, he showed little sign of it. Across the aisle, detectives who had spent months reopening the case watched silently. For them, the moment carried a strange mixture of relief and unfinished tension. They had reached the point every cold case investigator hopes to reach: an arrest, a name attached to the evidence, a suspect standing before a judge. But they also knew something the public did not yet understand. This case still held shadows. The prosecutor stood and summarized the charges. Murder in the first degree, related to the death of Melissa Carter on October 12, 1999. The words sounded stark in the quiet courtroom. A life taken. 21 years of silence. Now distilled into a single line of legal language. The judge reviewed the paperwork, then looked toward Harlan. "Mr. Harlan, you are being held without bail pending further proceedings." Harlan said nothing. No visible reaction. No protest. The hearing lasted less than 10 minutes. But outside the courthouse, The story erupted again. Television crews broadcast live updates. Analysts discussed the power of modern forensic technology. Commentators speculated about motive, about psychology, about the strange reality that a killer could walk free for decades before science finally caught up with him. Yet behind the headlines, detectives continued to search for something deeper. Because DNA explained who had been inside Melissa Carter's house. It did not explain why. Inside the cold case office, investigators reopened every box connected to the original file. Old evidence logs. Witness statements. Neighborhood interviews from 1999. Some of the pages had yellowed with age, typed on computers that no longer existed. The detectives read every line again. A small detail from one of the early witness interviews suddenly caught attention. A neighbor 3 houses down had reported seeing a man standing near the corner of the street around 10:30 p.m. that night. The man had been leaning against a parked vehicle, smoking. At the time, investigators had not considered it significant. The description was vague: average height, dark clothing, short hair. Nothing that could identify a specific person. But now, with Daniel Harlan in custody, the statement looked different. The neighbor had also mentioned something else. The car parked near the corner had been a dark-colored pickup truck. Detectives pulled vehicle records tied to Harlan from the late 1990s. One of the entries stopped them cold. In 1998, Daniel Harlan had registered a dark green Ford Ranger pickup. The truck had been sold years later, and the original investigators had never connected it to the crime scene. But the coincidence was impossible to ignore. If Harlan had been parked near the corner that night, he could have watched Melissa's house from a distance. Waiting. Observing. Timing his approach. Another piece of the puzzle began to form. Investigators revisited the delivery records from the office supply company where Harlan had worked. Among the archived route sheets, they discovered something unexpected. Melissa Carter's home address appeared once in the system. Just once. A delivery made 3 months before the murder. The package had been ordered by a small freelance design client who worked from Melissa's home temporarily that summer. It had been a routine shipment, printer cartridges and office folders. The driver assigned to the route that day was Daniel Harlan. The discovery changed the narrative completely. This meant Harlan had likely stood at Melissa's door months before the attack. He would have seen her face. Her house. Her dog. And perhaps something else, something that planted a seed inside his mind. Detectives tried to imagine the moment. A delivery driver knocks. Melissa opens the door. Maybe she smiles politely. Maybe she thanks him for the package. Maybe the interaction lasts less than 30 seconds. For Melissa, it might have been a forgettable moment. But for someone like Harlan, it might have meant something entirely different. Obsession often begins quietly. A brief encounter. A face remembered too vividly. A life observed from a distance. Investigators checked Harlan's phone and internet records from the early 2000s, hoping to uncover signs of stalking behavior or online searches connected to Melissa. But the technology of that era left few digital footprints. Much of the evidence that might have existed was simply gone. Still, the timeline felt increasingly clear. Harlan delivers the package during the summer of 1999. He notices Melissa. Perhaps he sees her again during other routes in the neighborhood. Perhaps he drives by intentionally. Then comes October. The phone call. The knock at the door. The single fatal strike. Yet even as the theory formed, detectives struggled with one detail that refused to settle. The speed of the crime. 1 wound. No prolonged struggle. No clear evidence of forced entry. It was almost as if the attack had happened the moment the door opened. Which raised an unsettling possibility. What if Harlan had not planned to kill her? What if he had planned something else entirely? A confrontation. An attempt to talk. An attempt to force a connection that existed only in his imagination. And when Melissa rejected him. When she told him to leave. When she tried to close the door. The knife appeared. A flash of anger. A moment of humiliation turning instantly into violence. One strike. One irreversible decision. The detectives could not prove that scenario. But it matched the evidence better than any other theory. Meanwhile, in jail, Daniel Harlan remained silent. His attorney advised him to say nothing. No interviews. No explanations. No answers. The investigators understood that silence was strategic. Without a confession, the case would rely heavily on forensic evidence and circumstantial reconstruction. Still, they believed the truth might eventually emerge. Because silence rarely lasts forever. Especially when a man realizes the world already knows the secret he tried to bury. Outside the courtroom, Melissa Carter's family stood before reporters for the first time in years. Her older sister spoke carefully, her voice steady despite the emotion behind it. For 21 years, we've lived without knowing who took Melissa from us, she said. Today doesn't bring her back. But it gives us something we never had before, an answer. Yet even as those words echoed across the microphones, the deeper mystery remained. Because the arrest of Daniel Harlan had solved one part of the cold case. But the final truth, the exact moment when obsession turned into murder, the words spoken at that door, the decision that ended Melissa Carter's life, still existed only inside the mind of the man accused of killing her. And Daniel Harlan, the quiet warehouse supervisor who had lived unnoticed for decades, continued to guard that truth behind an expressionless stare. A silence that had already lasted 21 years. And might, if he chose, last the rest of his life. The investigation did not slow after the arrest. In fact, the opposite happened. Once Daniel Harlan sat behind the thick concrete walls of the county jail, detectives understood something critical about cases like this. The arrest was only the beginning of the real battle. The story that had quietly rested in dusty evidence boxes for 21 years now had to stand up under the full weight of a courtroom. Every assumption would be challenged. Every piece of evidence would be examined under a microscope. And somewhere within the layers of the past, the final truth about that October night still waited. Inside the cold case office, investigators began reconstructing Daniel Harlan's life during the months leading up to the murder. They laid out timelines across long tables, connecting addresses, work shifts, delivery routes, pay stubs, and old witness accounts. The goal was simple: understand the man who had remained invisible for 2 decades. What they discovered was unsettling not because it was dramatic, but because it was so ordinary. Harlan's life in 1999 was quiet, structured, and repetitive. He worked long delivery shifts for the office supply company, driving the same routes through suburban neighborhoods around Sacramento. When the workday ended, he usually returned to a small rental apartment across town. Co-workers from that era remembered him as introverted, someone who rarely joined after-work gatherings or conversations in the break room. But several former employees recalled one thing that now seemed impossible to ignore. Harlan sometimes lingered during deliveries. Most drivers followed strict time schedules, dropping packages quickly before moving to the next address. But occasionally, according to co-workers, Harlan took longer routes or returned later than expected. At the time, supervisors assumed traffic delays or simple inefficiency. Now detectives wondered if something else had been happening. Something more deliberate. The records from the office supply company provided another small but important clue. After the delivery to Melissa Carter's home in July of 1999, Harlan had requested to keep that particular neighborhood on his assigned route for the following months. The request had not raised suspicion at the time. Drivers often preferred familiar neighborhoods. But in the context of the murder, the detail felt deeply disturbing. Because it meant Harlan might have been returning to Melissa's street repeatedly. Watching. Waiting. Learning. Detectives visited the neighborhood again, walking the same sidewalks that Harlan may have walked decades earlier. The houses had changed slightly: new paint, new fences, different cars in the driveways, but the structure of the street remained the same. Melissa Carter's house still stood near the curve of the road. The front porch. The small garden bed near the walkway. The window facing the street. From the corner where the witness had once reported seeing a dark pickup truck, investigators could clearly see the front door. It was the perfect vantage point. Far enough away to remain unnoticed. Close enough to watch who came and went. Standing there in the quiet afternoon light, one detective imagined the scene from October 1999. A truck parked in the shadows. A man inside watching the house. The porch light turning on. Melissa moving through the living room. The golden retriever walking behind her. The moment when the man inside the truck decided the time had come. Back in the present, investigators continued searching Harlan's past for something that might explain his behavior. Psychological patterns. Failed relationships. Signs of obsession. They located 2 former girlfriends who had dated Harlan briefly during the late 1990s. Both described similar experiences. At first, he seemed polite and reserved. Quiet. Attentive. But over time, something unsettling appeared beneath the surface. One woman remembered how intensely Harlan watched her during conversations, rarely blinking, rarely looking away. Another recalled how he reacted poorly when she tried to end the relationship, calling repeatedly for weeks before finally disappearing from her life. Neither woman had reported him to police. At the time, his behavior felt uncomfortable but not criminal. Now those memories carried a different weight. Investigators began forming a clearer picture of Harlan's personality. A man who struggled with rejection. A man who formed attachments quickly and intensely. A man who might have interpreted ordinary interactions as something far more meaningful. Which brought them back again to the brief delivery at Melissa Carter's house. If Harlan had constructed a fantasy connection with her based on nothing more than a 30-second exchange at the front door, then the phone call on October 12 might have been his attempt to turn that imagined connection into reality. The 14-second call. Detectives replayed the timeline repeatedly. 10:38 p.m., the phone rings. Melissa answers. Perhaps she hears a voice she does not recognize. Perhaps she says hello. Perhaps she asks who is calling. Then the line goes silent. 14 seconds later, the call ends. Minutes afterward, someone knocks at the door. The theory felt increasingly plausible. Harlan calls. Melissa doesn't recognize him. Maybe she sounds irritated. Maybe she hangs up. The rejection, however small, ignites something volatile inside his mind. So he drives to the house. Knocks on the door. And when Melissa realizes the man standing outside is someone she barely remembers, someone she does not want there, she tries to close the door. What happens next may have taken only seconds. A hand pushes the door open. A flash of steel. A single violent strike. The detectives had no confession to confirm this scenario. But the evidence aligned with it disturbingly well. Meanwhile, Daniel Harlan remained inside his jail cell, following the news coverage that now surrounded the case. Television reports played in the common area of the cell block, describing the forensic breakthrough that had led to his arrest. The phrase appeared repeatedly across the screen. New forensic technology cracks decades-old mystery. The world now understood the science behind the investigation. Genetic genealogy had taken a fragment of DNA left behind in 1999 and used it to build a family tree leading straight to Daniel Harlan. But technology alone had not solved the case. Patience had solved it. Detectives willing to reopen old files. Analysts willing to revisit forgotten evidence. Investigators who believed that even after 20 years, the truth could still be hiding inside a single microscopic strand of DNA. And now that strand had dragged the past into the present. Yet something else still troubled the detectives working the case. They had identified the killer. They had built the timeline. They had reconstructed the probable motive. But one haunting question still lingered like a shadow that refused to disappear. Why had Harlan left the fabric fragment behind? During the struggle, part of his clothing had torn loose and remained inside the hallway. That fragment carried the DNA that ultimately exposed him. But killers often attempt to retrieve or destroy evidence after a crime. Why hadn't he done that? The answer might lie in the speed of the attack. If the stabbing happened instantly, Harlan may have panicked the moment Melissa collapsed. The sudden reality of what he had done could have driven him into immediate flight. No time to check the hallway. No time to notice the torn fabric. Just the sound of his own breathing. The pounding of his heart. And the desperate need to escape the house before anyone saw him. If that theory was true, then Daniel Harlan had walked away from the scene believing he had committed the perfect crime. No witnesses. No fingerprints. No stolen property. No obvious connection to the victim. For 21 years, that belief had protected him. Until science finally reached back through time and found the one tiny mistake he never knew he had made. A piece of cloth. A trace of DNA. A silent clue waiting patiently for the future to arrive. And now that future had arrived, bringing the quiet man from apartment 204 face to face with the truth he had managed to outrun for more than 2 decades. But even as investigators prepared for the coming trial, the story of Melissa Carter's final moments still remained incomplete. Because the only person who truly knew what had happened in that hallway, the only person who knew the exact words spoken, the exact emotions that erupted in those fatal seconds, continued to say nothing. And Daniel Harlan's silence still held the final piece of the mystery. The past had finally begun to speak, but its voice carried more questions than answers. News of the arrest spread quickly across Minnesota. For many residents, it felt surreal. For 25 years, the case had been nothing more than a quiet scar in the town's history, a tragedy mentioned only occasionally, usually in hushed conversations. Now it was suddenly alive again. Reporters gathered outside the courthouse. Old newspaper archives were pulled out and revisited. Photographs from the year 2000 resurfaced online, showing police tape stretched across a quiet street and flashing patrol lights cutting through the night. For the victim's family, the attention was overwhelming. They had spent decades living with uncertainty. Birthdays, holidays, and anniversaries had passed with the same unanswered question lingering in the background: who had taken her life, and why? Now, finally, there was a name. But the name alone did not bring peace. Investigators continued to reconstruct the final hours before the crime. Every witness statement, every piece of physical evidence, and every fragment of digital data was examined again, this time with modern tools and new perspective. The timeline slowly became clearer. Late that evening in 2000, the victim had been seen leaving a small gathering with friends. Several witnesses recalled that nothing seemed unusual. She appeared relaxed, even laughing as she said goodbye. Sometime after midnight, she vanished. At the time, police searched the area extensively. Patrol officers canvassed nearby neighborhoods, questioned drivers, and checked businesses along the surrounding roads. But the trail quickly went cold. Now, decades later, the breakthrough came from a piece of evidence that had sat quietly in storage for years, a trace of DNA that could not be properly analyzed at the time. When forensic specialists re-examined it using modern genetic technology, the profile finally produced a match. The result pointed to a man who had never been seriously considered during the original investigation. Detectives were stunned. For years, the suspect had lived only a few miles away. He worked ordinary jobs, paid his bills, and blended into the routines of everyday life. Neighbors described him as quiet but polite, the kind of person who rarely drew attention. No one imagined that he might be connected to one of the town's most haunting cold case mysteries. As detectives began digging deeper into his past, small details began to surface. Old addresses. Past employment records. A vehicle registered under his name that matched a vague description once mentioned by a witness back in 2000. Individually, these clues might have seemed insignificant. But together, they began to form a disturbing pattern. Prosecutors now faced the enormous task of preparing a case built across 2 decades of time. Evidence had to be carefully documented. Witness memories had to be verified. And the defense would almost certainly challenge every detail. Meanwhile, investigators quietly began reviewing other unsolved cases from the same period. It was a routine step, but one that sometimes leads to unexpected discoveries. Because history has shown that when one cold case is finally solved, it can sometimes open the door to others. And as one veteran detective involved in the investigation reportedly said during a briefing, "After 25 years, we finally have answers. But we also have a responsibility to make sure this isn't only the beginning." For the town of Minnesota, the long-buried mystery of the year 2000 was finally resurfacing. And the truth, piece by piece, was still unfolding. The courtroom felt heavier than anyone expected. Not loud. Not chaotic. Just heavy, the kind of silence that presses down on everyone inside the room. For 25 years the case had existed as an unfinished story. A photograph on a memorial table. A name repeated during anniversaries. A line in police archives marked cold case. Now it was evidence. Testimony. A man sitting at the defense table. The trial opened with the slow, methodical rhythm that long investigations often carry into the courtroom. Prosecutors knew they were not only presenting a case, they were resurrecting an event that had happened a quarter of a century earlier. Memories had faded. Witnesses had aged. Some people who once held pieces of the story were no longer alive. But one thing had not faded. The evidence. And at the center of it all stood the piece that had changed everything, the DNA. The jury listened carefully as forensic specialists explained how the original evidence from 2000 had been preserved. Back then, the technology simply wasn't capable of identifying a clear match. The sample existed, but it was like a voice speaking in a language investigators couldn't yet understand. Years passed. Technology advanced. And in 2025, the same sample was analyzed again, this time with modern genetic sequencing methods powerful enough to detect even the faintest traces. The result produced a clear profile. That profile pointed directly to the suspect. The defense immediately pushed back. They argued contamination, chain of custody issues, the possibility that the sample had been mishandled during the decades it spent in storage. Experts were called to explain how evidence is sealed, catalogued, and protected. Every movement of the sample through the years had been recorded. Every technician who touched it had left a documented trail. And slowly, piece by piece, the prosecution rebuilt the night of the crime. Witnesses described seeing a car near the area where the victim was last known to be. A vehicle similar to one owned by the defendant at the time. Another witness recalled hearing an argument not far from the street where the victim disappeared. At the time it had seemed like nothing more than late-night noise. Now it sounded different. Investigators presented phone records, primitive compared to modern standards, but still useful. The defendant's movements that night didn't align with the alibi he had once given. The gaps were small. But they were there. And then came the moment that no one in the courtroom seemed prepared for. The victim's sister took the stand. Her voice was calm, but the emotion behind it filled the room. She described the last conversation she had with her sister in 2000. A short phone call. Plans for the weekend. A promise to meet again soon. A promise that was never kept. She spoke about birthdays that passed without celebration. Holidays that felt incomplete. A chair at the family table that remained empty year after year. And then she said something that stayed with everyone listening. For 25 years, we didn't know who took her from us. We only knew that someone did. And that someone walked free. The courtroom fell silent again. Because everyone understood what she meant. For 25 years the person responsible had continued living an ordinary life. Working. Driving. Shopping at the same stores. Passing through the same streets where people still remembered the night everything changed. The defense tried to maintain doubt. They emphasized the time gap. They questioned witness memories. They pointed out that no one had seen the actual crime take place. But the prosecution didn't need a witness to the act. They had something stronger. Science. And science, unlike memory, does not forget. The forensic analyst returned to the stand during the final days of testimony. This time the explanation was simpler. The DNA found at the scene. The DNA recovered from preserved evidence. The DNA taken from the defendant after his arrest. All three matched. Statistically, The probability of it belonging to someone else was so small that the number stretched across multiple lines of scientific notation. The courtroom understood the implication immediately. For a moment, the long timeline of the case seemed to collapse into a single point. 25 years of silence. And then a single match. Closing arguments arrived like the final chapter of a story that had waited decades to be told. The prosecutor stood before the jury and spoke slowly. "This case was once called a cold case," he said. "Not because it was forgotten, but because we simply didn't have the tools to uncover the truth." He paused, letting the words settle in the room. But the truth never disappeared. It waited. Across the courtroom, the defendant sat motionless. No visible reaction. No emotion. Just the quiet stillness of someone listening to the final pieces of a puzzle fall into place. Outside the courthouse, the town watched closely. Local news stations broadcast updates every evening. Residents who had once followed the case in the year 2000 now found themselves watching its conclusion decades later. Parents who had been young adults at the time now explained the story to their children. A mystery that had haunted one generation was suddenly becoming real to the next. And in homes across the community, the same question was whispered again and again. How had the truth stayed hidden for so long? The answer was simple. Time. Time changes everything. It erases memories. It hides mistakes. But sometimes, when evidence is preserved and investigators refuse to let go, time also reveals the truth. For the victim's family, the trial represented something they had nearly stopped hoping for. Not revenge. Not even closure. Just recognition. Recognition that what happened that night mattered. That the loss they carried for 25 years had not been ignored. The jury would soon decide the outcome. But regardless of the verdict, one thing had already changed forever. The case was no longer an unsolved mystery. It was no longer just another cold case buried in police archives. It was a story finally brought into the light. And the light had revealed something that had been hiding in plain sight all along. The verdict arrived on a grey morning that felt strangely ordinary. Outside the courthouse, the town moved through its routines like any other day, traffic lights blinking from red to green, people hurrying into coffee shops, the quiet rhythm of a place that had lived for decades beside an unanswered question. Inside the courtroom, that question was about to meet its final moment. The jury had spent hours reviewing testimony that stretched across 25 years of time. Evidence gathered in 2000. Evidence re-examined in 2025. Voices from the past and voices from the present layered together like pieces of a long-buried puzzle. When the jurors finally returned, the room felt smaller somehow. No one spoke. The defendant stared forward. The victim's family held their breath. The clerk stood and read the decision. And just like that, the silence broke. A guilty verdict does not arrive with dramatic music or flashing lights. It arrives in a simple voice, spoken into the still air of a courtroom. But the effect was immediate. The long shadow hanging over the case, the uncertainty, the speculation, the decades of whispers, collapsed in a single moment. For 25 years the investigation had been known as a cold case, a phrase that carries its own kind of quiet resignation. A crime with no answer. A file resting in an archive drawer. Now the label no longer applied. The story had finally reached its end. The victim's family sat motionless as the words settled into reality. Some cried. Others simply stared ahead, as if trying to absorb the fact that the wait was finally over. There was no cheering. No celebration. Justice rarely feels triumphant in cases like this. Instead, the emotion in the room felt deeper, a mixture of relief, grief, and exhaustion that had been building for decades. Outside the courthouse, reporters quickly delivered the news. 25-year-old cold case solved. The headline traveled across television broadcasts and news websites within minutes. People who remembered the original investigation stopped what they were doing to watch. Many of them were older now. Some had children who were not even born when the crime occurred. Yet the memory of that night in 2000 had never completely disappeared. For years the story had circulated through the town like an unfinished sentence. Neighbors remembered the flashing police lights, the search teams moving through the streets, the uneasy feeling that something terrible had happened just beyond the edge of ordinary life. And for years afterward, nothing. No arrest. No answers. Just time passing. Time turning tragedy into a fading headline. But time also preserved something else. Evidence. Detectives who worked the original investigation had retired long ago, but their work remained carefully stored inside evidence lockers and case files. They had done what they could with the technology available at the time. The rest had to wait for the future. When modern forensic analysis finally unlocked the DNA profile hidden inside that decades-old evidence, it was like opening a sealed message from the past. A message that had been waiting patiently for someone to understand it. Investigators often say that evidence never forgets. People forget. Witnesses move away. Memories fade. But the smallest trace, a fingerprint, a drop of blood, a strand of hair, can remain silent for years and then suddenly speak when science catches up. That is exactly what happened here. And when it did, the case that once seemed permanently frozen came back to life. The sentencing hearing weeks later was quieter but no less emotional. The judge spoke carefully, acknowledging the extraordinary length of time that had passed since the crime. He described the patience of investigators, the perseverance of forensic scientists, and the determination of a family that refused to let the memory of their loved one disappear. Then he delivered the sentence. The defendant would spend the rest of his life in prison. The words echoed briefly inside the courtroom before dissolving into silence again. For the victim's family, the moment carried complicated meaning. Nothing could restore what had been lost. 25 years of birthdays, holidays, and ordinary moments had already passed without her. Justice could not return those years. But it could finally answer the question that had haunted them for so long. Who did this? Now they knew. Outside the courthouse that afternoon, the victim's sister spoke to reporters. Her voice was steady. "We waited a long time for this day," she said. "And for a long time we wondered if it would ever come." She paused, looking toward the steps of the building behind her. But the truth has a way of surviving. Those words captured something investigators understand better than anyone. Time can bury a crime. But it cannot always hide it forever. Across the country, thousands of unsolved cases still sit quietly inside police archives. Files marked cold case, evidence boxes labeled with dates from decades past. Most people assume those cases are finished. Forgotten. But sometimes they are simply waiting. Waiting for new technology. Waiting for a new detective to notice a detail everyone else overlooked. Waiting for a single piece of evidence to finally reveal the story it has carried all along. The case from Minnesota became one more example of that quiet possibility. A reminder that even after 25 years, truth can still emerge from the shadows. And long after the headlines fade and the cameras disappear, the legacy of the case remains in the community where it began. A street where people still remember the flashing lights from that night. A courthouse where a verdict finally ended decades of uncertainty. And a family that spent a quarter of a century living with a question that now, at last, has an answer. Because sometimes a cold case is not the end of the story. Sometimes it is simply the beginning of a very long wait for the truth. The case should have ended with the verdict. That's how stories are supposed to work. A crime is committed. An investigation unfolds. A suspect is caught. A courtroom delivers justice. The final chapter closes and the town breathes again. But reality rarely follows the clean lines of a story. Even after the conviction, the echoes of the case continued moving through the community like distant thunder, low, persistent, impossible to ignore. Because when a cold case survives for 25 years, it becomes more than just a crime. It becomes part of the town's memory. People remember where they were when they first heard about it. They remember the uneasy silence that spread through neighborhoods that once felt safe. They remember the way parents suddenly became more protective, the way streetlights seemed dimmer at night. For years, that memory had no ending. Now it did. But endings can be strange things. The day after the sentencing, the courthouse steps were quiet again. Reporters packed up their equipment. News vans disappeared from the streets. The cameras that had once followed every moment of the trial moved on to other stories. Inside the police department, however, the case was still being discussed. Detectives gathered around conference tables reviewing old files once more, not because they doubted the verdict, but because solving a crime after decades often changes the way investigators look at everything else. One solved cold case can sometimes unlock others. Patterns emerge. Connections appear where none were visible before. Investigators began quietly reopening files from the late 1990s and early 2000s. Missing persons reports. Unsolved assaults. Incidents that once seemed unrelated but occurred within the same region and time frame. Most of them would likely remain exactly what they had always been, tragic mysteries waiting for answers. But every detective knows the same truth. Sometimes the smallest overlooked detail becomes the key. Across the country, forensic laboratories were also paying attention to what had happened in Minnesota. The breakthrough that identified the suspect had relied on technology that barely existed 2 decades earlier. Genetic sequencing tools had grown dramatically more powerful. Evidence once considered too degraded or too incomplete could now be analyzed with astonishing precision. It meant something profound for the future of criminal investigations. Cases that once seemed permanently frozen might not stay that way forever. For the victim's family, though, the future looked different. For 25 years their lives had been shaped by uncertainty. Every new lead, every rumor, every update from detectives had stirred hope and fear in equal measure. Now the waiting was over. The answers they had searched for had finally arrived. But closure is not the same as healing. Grief does not follow courtroom timelines. It moves slowly, quietly, often resurfacing when people least expect it. On the anniversary of the crime the following year, the family visited the memorial site that had been placed near the area where the victim was last seen alive. For decades it had been a place of quiet remembrance, flowers left by strangers, candles lit on cold nights, handwritten notes fading in the rain. This time felt different. There was still sadness, still the deep ache of loss that time cannot erase. But there was also something new. Certainty. The mystery that once surrounded that spot had finally been lifted. The truth, hidden for so long, had emerged. Residents of the town felt the change as well. Conversations about the case no longer ended with speculation or uneasy questions. Instead, people spoke about perseverance. About the detectives who never allowed the file to disappear into permanent storage. About the forensic scientists who re-examined evidence that others might have considered too old to matter. About the idea that justice, even when delayed by decades, can still arrive. At the police department, the case file was eventually moved out of the unsolved archives and placed among closed investigations. The label that had followed it for so long, cold case, was finally removed. But the story itself did not disappear. New detectives studying investigative techniques would read through the file as part of their training. They would examine the early mistakes, the missed opportunities, the persistence that eventually led to the breakthrough. And they would learn something every investigator eventually understands. Time is both the enemy and the ally of justice. Time allows criminals to believe they have escaped. But time also allows science to advance. It allows technology to evolve. It allows forgotten evidence to become powerful again. Years from now, when new cases emerge and investigators face the same frustrating silence that once surrounded the crime in 2000, they will remember this story. A case that slept for 25 years. A single fragment of DNA waiting quietly in an evidence locker. And the moment modern science finally gave that fragment a voice. Because somewhere, in police departments across the world, there are still thousands of files stamped with the same haunting words. Cold case. Boxes filled with photographs. Witness statements typed on aging paper. Evidence sealed and labeled with dates from decades ago. Most people assume those cases belong to the past. But sometimes the past is only waiting for the future to catch up. And when it does, the silence breaks. The truth steps forward. And a mystery that once seemed permanent finally finds its ending.